Good evening, everyone. I am Reverend Bob Moore. I'm Executive Director of the Coalition for Peace Action, and I want to welcome you this evening to this webinar on reducing the nuclear danger in the wake of Russia's war on Ukraine. I want to give you just a short overview of how the webinar is going to happen, and then I'll introduce our keynote speaker. And so that will be how we start after my welcome is done, is we'll have our keynote speaker speak. And then we'll have a respondent, Ed Aguilar, who is our Philadelphia and Pennsylvania director for Coalition for Peace Action. And then we're going to have a question and answer period, which I often find is the most interesting part of these webinars. And for that, we're going to ask you to post your messages in the chat box. And I believe our settings are such that you should only be able to send those to the host and co-host, which is myself, Daryl, and Ed. Preferably, I would like you to send those to my name, if you could select my name, Reverend Bob Moore, as the place you send those to, and then we'll ask as many as we can, and I'll group them together if it seems appropriate. And so it is exciting to me to be able to introduce somebody who I think has very deep knowledge and breadth and depth of knowledge about the nuclear weapons issue, especially as it pertains to treaties and to the world situation currently. And that is Daryl Kimball. Daryl has been the executive director of the Arms Control Association based in Washington, D.C. As I see arms control experts quoted in the various newspapers around the country, including the most reputable ones, the name I see, I think, more often than any other is Daryl's name, and with good reason. He is considered to be a bona fide top expert on these issues. Previously, he was on the staff at Physicians for Social Responsibility from 1989 to 1997, and was executive director of the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Danger from 1997 to 2001. And as I mentioned, since 2001, he's been executive director at the Arms Control Association. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daryl. We're looking very much forward to your presentation, Daryl.
Well, thanks a lot, Bob. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Before I start to offer observations about the danger of nuclear weapons in the wake of Russia's war, let me just also note that before my professional time in Washington, I came from the grassroots, going back to my college days at Miami University in Ohio, and the nuclear freeze campaign, which was going on when I was in high school. And so that's where I got my start. And so I appreciate the work that many of you are doing in the field, in the community, in your communities about these issues. So the topic is reducing the nuclear danger in the wake of Russia's war on Ukraine. And most of the attention in the last year since Putin's decision to launch his massive assault on democratic, independent, non-nuclear Ukraine has been on the many thousands who've been killed, the millions displaced, the back and forth of the conflict. But as many of you already know, the conflict and Putin's nuclear threats have raised the specter of nuclear conflict, and I think, and many others agree, raise the risk of nuclear use to a level that we've not seen in many, many years. It's also put at risk further progress to reduce the bloated US and Russian nuclear arsenals, which is essential, especially now with the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the only one that's left between the US and Russia, expiring in 2026. So we need to get that back on track. But as I'll talk about, the war has also derailed some of the early efforts to begin talks between the US and Russia on a replacement agreement for New START. Now, let me talk a little bit first about the nuclear weapons threats that we've heard about through the year, what they've been, what Putin's been trying to do, what some of the implications are, and what some of the responses, important responses, have been through the course of the year from civil society and governments. So we saw at the beginning of the war, Putin talking about nuclear weapons on February 24th. No matter who tries to stand in our way, they must know that Russia will respond immediately and with consequences that will be such as you have never seen in your entire history. If someone wants to interfere from the outside and creates an unacceptable threat of a strategic nature for Russia, the response will be lightning fast. Decisions in this matter have been made. He said on February 24th and then again on April 27th. So these statements were clearly designed to warn NATO and the United States not to become directly involved in the conflict. He also raised the readiness level of Russian forces in early February. And these kinds of threats through the history of the Cold War have not really been anything that's new. They were not uncommon during the Cold War. But these implied threats from Putin to shield attack by a nuclear-armed state against a non-nuclear weapon state were, I think, unprecedented in the post-Cold War era. We've not seen, since the Soviet Union dissolved, any US or Russian leader raising the alert level of nuclear forces, making these kinds of very clear, even if veiled, nuclear threats to try to coerce adversary behavior. We got to also remember that these threats also violate an agreement that many of us might never have known about, might have forgotten about, the 1973 bilateral agreement on the prevention of nuclear war, which pledged the US and Russia to refrain from the threat or use of force against another party, against the allies of the other party, and against other countries in circumstances which may endanger international peace and security. So, there's, for good reason, the world became alarmed in February, March, April about the nuclear dimension of this conflict. And part of the concern was how would the United States and NATO respond? And I think, we're fortunate that Biden did not himself engage in similar inflammatory nuclear rhetoric, didn't raise the alert status of US forces at the time. I remember the morning the news came out about Putin raising the alert level of these forces. I was having a very pleasant breakfast with my partner Sally and our daughter who's in college, and got a phone call from the AP reporter, and my jaw just dropped. I mean, this is a moment that was, I think, that concerned all of us. But thankfully, Biden did not respond in kind. At the time, the Biden administration called this nuclear rhetoric from Putin irresponsible. He would say, I think, some other things later that actually were more helpful, but he did not respond in kind. But nevertheless, one of the things that we ought to remember about this conflict is that even if that moment did not lead to a crisis, the ongoing danger of nuclear escalation is there every day because we have not had a major war in Europe in the entire nuclear era. And all it takes is a close encounter between NATO and Russian warplanes or an attack by Russia on NATO territory. We saw the errant Ukrainian air defense missile hitting Polish territory just a couple of weeks ago, or something similar involving accidental NATO strike on a Russian military asset. That could become a flashpoint for a wider conflict. The other reason why we need to be concerned on an ongoing basis about the potential for nuclear escalation is Russian and US nuclear strategies technically reserve the option under extreme circumstances to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear threats. So any fighting between NATO and Russian conventional forces could go nuclear relatively quickly. So as you all know, but I'm going to say this anyway, such thinking is, of course, extremely risky. If nuclear weapons are used in a conflict between nuclear armed adversaries, we're in completely uncharted territory. Theories that suggest that nuclear war can be limited and that we can prevent escalation up the nuclear escalation ladder, as nuclear war planners call it. These are just theories. And in practice, we're going to be dealing with the fog of war and the fog of nuclear war, which is even thicker. So there's no guarantee that once nuclear weapons might be used by either side, it would not quickly become an all-out nuclear conflagration. So to prevent Putin's threats, it's been important through the course of the year and going forward in the future that global leaders, opinion leaders, civil society underscore why everyone loses, especially Russia, if Putin breaks the 77-year-long taboo against nuclear weapons use. And we need to be doing this now and not after the fact. And many governments and non-governmental organizations, opinion leaders have been doing this. And the most important and one of the earliest formal statements in response to Putin's nuclear threats came from the June conference of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They issued a political declaration in connection with this formal meeting about TPNW treaty implementation, and that statement condemned all threats to use nuclear weapons as violations of international law, including the UN Charter, and the declaration demanded, quote, that all nuclear armed states never use or threaten to use nuclear weapons under any circumstances. So that came from 83 non-nuclear weapon states, including some countries that have been kind of on the fence in about the war in Ukraine, including countries like South Africa. Now, there's also, of course, and this has been a more recent concern, the possibility of an escalation of fighting beyond the borders of Ukraine to involve NATO and Russian forces and territory. And there's also the potential, albeit small, I think that Russia might consider the use of short-range nuclear weapons against Ukraine itself. This was a concern that started much earlier this year, but became much more significant later this year. Back in April, CIA Director Bill Burns said that although there is no sign that Russia is preparing to use tactical short-range nuclear weapons, none of us, he said, can take lightly the threat posed by a potential resort to tactical nuclear weapons or low-yield nuclear weapons. And indeed, when Putin spoke again about nukes in his September 21 call-up speech, the national address announcing an increased mobilization of Russian forces, Putin said, and I quote, "When the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will certainly use all means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff," unquote. So Putin's words pretty clearly implied that if he believed there was an attack on Russian territory or on Ukrainian territory illegally claimed by Russia, he might order the use of tactical nuclear weapons to decimate Ukraine's defense forces or its cities, to demonstrate Russian resolve, or in some way or another to attempt to force Ukraine and its allies to surrender. Now, this statement, I think, carried additional meaning because at that moment, as we're all pretty aware, the statement came as Russia was suffering significant military losses on the battlefield and on the very eve of Russia's declaration that it would illegally annex 4 Ukrainian provinces. So that is the statement, which probably in combination with some other intelligence that the United States government was picking up about chatter in the Russian military about nuclear use, That was a statement from Putin that led Joe Biden to say on October 6th that the, quote, prospect of Armageddon is the highest since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So I don't know where you all were that morning, but that was a little bit of a jolt. So, I mean, since September 21, though, there's some good news and there's been a good response. Since that statement, Putin has gotten public criticism for engaging in that inflammatory nuclear rhetoric by Biden, of course, European allies, of course, but more importantly, I think, from the leaders of China and India, and perhaps most importantly, the summit of the G20 industrialized countries that were meeting in Bali, Indonesia. And they declared, and this came pretty close to the TP&W states declaration, that nuclear weapons use or threat of use is inadmissible. Kind of a elastic term, but it was pretty clear. And statement that came from India, China, Indonesia, the other European industrialized states. That was a strong statement. And so in the days since then, this was not too long ago, Putin has dialed back his nuclear rhetoric. And he's gotten some internal pushback from inside Russia, from, I would say, the foreign policy establishment in Russia. And he's now saying that he's not planning to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. And he was just reminding the world that Russia is in a condition of nuclear deterrence with the United States and NATO. But of course, Putin is Putin. We can't be certain that he's not going to engage in nuclear brinksmanship again, especially as some sort of endgame to his Ukraine war fiasco approaches. And we might talk about when that might be, but I don't think any of us knows exactly how this thing is going to end. And of course, if he becomes more desperate in that end game, he might again consider employing nuclear threats, and maybe even thinking about, if he gets really desperate, using a small number of short-range nuclear weapons to try to tip the military balance in Russia's favor, or to try to end the conflict. So we're not out of the woods yet. I think the other thing we need to think about as we look at the whole spectrum of the nuclear threats and the conversation and the role of nuclear weapons in this conflict is that Russia is using the threat of nuclear weapons to try to provide cover for a major conventional military intervention against a non-nuclear weapon state, which is one of the more egregious aspects of this. We must also recognize that that's not a uniquely Russian idea. It's an idea that the United States has employed in the past and more recently. And there's one quote to keep in mind, is that Admiral Charles Richard, who just recently ended his term as the head of U.S. Strategic Command, said back in February of 2021, a year before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, "We must acknowledge the foundational nature of our nation's strategic nuclear forces, as they create maneuver space for us to project conventional military power strategically." So that's military speak, military jargon for our nuclear weapons help us project conventional military force elsewhere. And Richard Nixon, going back to 1969, tried a similar kind of nuclear gambit against the North Vietnamese. He launched a secret nuclear alert in October of 1969, which was meant to signal to the North Vietnamese that he might be mad enough to use nuclear weapons in the US war on Vietnam. The North Vietnamese, being tough buggers, did not back down. They kept fighting. But it's in many ways a very similar kind of nuclear saber rattling, a nuclear threat to what Putin has tried to do over the past year. The other thing is, we debate nuclear weapons out into the future and we look at the lessons of the war in Ukraine. I think we can also say with some confidence that Putin's invasion underscores the fact that nuclear weapons do not prevent major wars. Rather, they facilitate aggression by nuclear armed states and make wars waged by nuclear armed states far more dangerous, because there's an increased risk of miscalculation and miscommunication. Um, and then, we've heard over the last year NATO countries and NATO itself arguing that because Russia has not attacked NATO members, this shows the utility of nuclear weapons as a deterrent against aggression by Russia. I think another interpretation is that US and NATO nuclear weapons have been absolutely useless in preventing Russian aggression against Ukraine. Russia is probably, when it comes to military deterrence, much more deterred by NATO's combined conventional strength. We've seen how Russia's conventional forces have performed extremely poorly on the battlefield, and they must be even more concerned about any future direct military engagement with NATO forces in the future. So I think nuclear weapons have been shown to be irrelevant for the defense of Ukraine, irrelevant for Russia's aggressive ambitions here, not relevant for NATO's self-defense against potential future Russian aggression, and they've increased the risk factor, as I was just describing. The other thing is that the more that NATO emphasizes the value of nuclear deterrence, or for that matter, the United States government, the more legitimacy it lends to what Putin has done, and to Putin's nuclear threats and the mistaken and dangerous belief that nuclear weapons are necessary for self-defense. So, I think Pope Francis captured all of this quite well in a pithy statement that he made in 2017 at a conference on nuclear weapons that was held at the Vatican. He said, nuclear weapons exist in the service of a mentality of fear that affects not only the parties in conflict, but the entire human race, and create nothing but a false sense of security. So those are some thoughts about the threats of nuclear weapons use that we've seen, what some of the implications are, what we're going to have to be doing as we go out into the future to respond with vigor and resolve to condemn any future implied or explicit nuclear threats by anyone. But the other facet of the war, the other nuclear dimension, and the other threat that it has created is that Putin's decision to invade Ukraine has derailed the very fragile dialogue that had begun a year earlier between the US and Russia that was called the Strategic Stability Dialogue. If you remember, Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin met for less than a day in Geneva for a summit. It was kind of a frosty meeting, but one of the things they decided to do was to launch a strategic stability dialogue, which is kind of national security speak for measures designed to prevent one or the other side from feeling vulnerable to a nuclear attack. And that dialogue began in September. They had another meeting in October. And there was one more emergency meeting of the Strategic Stability Dialogue on the eve of Russia's invasion. And at that point, Russia injected into this dialogue, which was mainly about nuclear weapons and arms control. They injected a number of the issues that they wanted on the negotiating table vis-a-vis NATO's expansion, the territorial claims they had about Ukraine. The two sides didn't get too far. And after the invasion, the United States broke off this strategic stability dialogue. So the question is how to get this moving again. This was the beginning of the negotiation on a new nuclear arms control agreement to replace the only one we have left, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which is a modest agreement. If you remember, this was the agreement negotiated in 2010 by Barack Obama and Dmitry Medvedev. It was extended in early 2021 by Biden and Putin for another 5 years. So it's lasting until 2026. It limits each side to no more than 1,500 deployed strategic warheads on 700 land and sea-based missiles and bombers, which is more than enough to ruin our day, if any portion of that arsenal is used, of course. So, both sides at this stage, the United States and Russia, recognize the need for an agreement or agreements to replace New START, because neither one of them want the unpredictability that we would have if there are no legally binding, verifiable limits on these arsenals. It would create all sorts of problems for the militaries, for their planning. Worst case thinking would creep into the equation. An already bad situation would become worse. So in June, in a good sign, Joe Biden said in a message to the Arms Control Association, of all things, on the occasion of our 50th anniversary, he said, even as we rally the world to hold Russia accountable for its brutal and unprovoked war in Ukraine, we must continue to engage Russia on issues of strategic stability. And then about 2 months later, he said that the United States was ready to launch negotiations with Russia on a new nuclear arms control framework to supersede New START. Putin expressed similar words, a little vaguer. He said Russia is open to dialogue on ensuring strategic stability, preserving agreements on non-proliferation, and improving the situation on arms control. But the problem is, in recent days, and this is just within the last month, Putin has intervened to cancel a meeting between the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the U.S. State Department on the implementation of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. One of the things that they've got to figure out is how to resume the inspections under New START. They're allowed to have as many as 18 on-site inspections each year, but because of COVID, they suspended these inspections back in March of 2020. And then because of the war, the United States put in place visa restrictions and commercial flight restrictions on aircraft from Russia. So as a result, the Russian inspectors cannot, as they could before, catch a commercial flight, come to the United States, get a visa, and go inspect. So they have to figure all these different things out. They need this implementation meeting, but less than 24 hours before it was supposed to happen, it was canceled by the Russians. And it's pretty clear that Putin is making this decision, and he's directed his foreign minister to say that, quote, it is impossible to discuss strategic stability against the background of the situation in Ukraine. So they're linking the war in Ukraine somehow to this implementation of New START and future talks on nuclear arms control. However, other Russian officials have said they remain open to resuming the dialogue and negotiating a new arms control agreement to supersede New START, but Washington has to take the first step. So that's where we stand. It is a very precarious moment in terms of maintaining the very basic guardrails in the US-Russian nuclear relationship. And I'm almost old enough to remember, I was 7 years old when this happened, but the first nuclear arms control agreement between the two countries was in 1972. We've had something in place since then. And so if the United States and Russia cannot find a way to replace New START, we're going to be operating in a world that we've not seen in 50 plus years. And for all of us who are interested in reducing and eliminating the nuclear threat, that would be a big, big hurdle. So let me just mention very quickly, and then I'm going to wrap up and we can get to Ed's comments. If and when the U.S.-Russian talks on a new arms control or arms reduction agreement resume, there are going to be several difficult issues to deal with if they can screen the Ukraine war out of the picture. The first is, what are going to be the limits on the long-range nuclear weapons, the strategic arsenals? That's what New START covers. Ideally, the two sides agree to lower limits than the 1,550. But given how difficult relations are, given the United States' concerns about China's increasing nuclear arsenal, I think we'd be lucky to keep the existing limits in place for a longer period of time. The other problem here, of course, is that we have a US political system that is about as dysfunctional as any of us have seen it. The United States Senate has a hard time agreeing on what day of the week it is. It would be very difficult, I think, to get 67 senators to agree on a new nuclear arms control agreement with the Russians. That's just a reality. The New START agreement, as modest and straightforward as it was, it only got 71 votes back in 2010. The situation today, the partisanship on the Hill is even more challenging. So one of the things that we need to think about is alternative approaches to maintain limits on both sides' stockpiles. At a very minimum, the two presidents could issue unilateral reciprocal political commitments to respect the basic limits of New START into the future until a new treaty is negotiated, right? Or there could be an executive agreement between the two presidents that's legally binding, but it's not in the form of a treaty that is supposed to be ratified by the Senate. That could meet with opposition from Congress, but that's an alternative. That's actually the form that the first US-Russian Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty took. The SALT I agreement was an executive agreement. So that's the main issue I think they need to focus on. That's the highest priority. But there are other issues. The United States is going to want to explore measures to address Russia's larger stockpile of short-range nuclear weapons. Russia probably has 1,000 to 2,000. The United States has maybe 300 or 400. The way they could start to make progress would simply be to share declarations of what each side has and explore some very basic verification measures to monitor those declarations. That would be a starting point. Beyond that, I think it could be very difficult to agree to anything. They're going to be talking about missile defense. Russia continues to be concerned about how future US missile defense capabilities could affect Russia's ability to hit back if they're struck. At a minimum, the United States could provide ideas, or I should say, reporting about what we plan to do, so the Russians can understand what they might have to counter or what they might have to overcome. That could help provide some confidence on the Russian side and the US side about how much lower we could go without missile defenses affecting the strategic equation. And then remember the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is no longer with us due to some Russian non-compliance with the treaty. The Trump administration pulled out without really trying to fix this. So there's no prohibition on intermediate range missiles, the Euro missiles that were such a concern in the 80s. Russia has actually proposed a regional prohibition on such missiles. It's a flawed idea. It requires some work, but the United States can and should make a counterproposal. And it's in both sides' interest to talk about intermediate range missiles too. So there is a lot on the agenda. And even in good times, it would be difficult to get these things done. But that's the situation we're in. So to conclude, I mean, Putin's war on Ukraine and the nuclear dimension is a sobering reminder that nuclear deterrence strategies create unsustainable, unacceptable risks. And the only way we're going to eliminate these dangers is to reinforce the taboo against nuclear use and to get the US and Russia and China and the other nuclear armed countries on a sustainable path towards elimination. And that begins, I think, with pressing the nuclear armed states, US and Russia in particular, to get back to the negotiating table, to renew basic US-Russian nuclear arms control diplomacy. We also need to find ways, as we see, I think there are going to be further nuclear threats down the road. We need to make sure that the international community continues to respond to that by trying to reinforce the legal and political norms against nuclear use and threats, by condemning all forms of nuclear threats. I mean, nuclear deterrence, as practiced by the United States, is a form of a nuclear threat. It's just a much more polite way of doing it than what Putin has done. And then, because we're going to be in this, we need to be encouraging US and Russian leaders, the White House and the Kremlin, the Defense Department and the State Department, with their counterparts, to maintain lines of communication to prevent miscommunication, miscalculation that could lead to escalation. And we need to encourage all of our leaders in Washington, to the extent that we can elsewhere, to refrain from further nuclear rhetoric and threats. So, it's a daunting set of problems we have. But I will just remind us all that, we've faced some of these issues in the past. The power of people working in small communities, big communities across the United States, in other countries, to create pressure on US and other leaders to take the actions to move us back from the brink. And we're going to have to do it again. I think it's going to take focus in 2023. It's going to take a more combined and coordinated effort amongst non-governmental organizations like mine with others in Washington, more coordination amongst the organizations across the United States in the grassroots, and with some of our international partners like ICANN, with whom we talk and strategize quite frequently. So let me stop there. I'm interested in Ed's thoughts. I'm interested in everybody's reactions and suggestions about how we get out of this situation we have today. I'm sorry I don't have better news.
Thank you very much, Daryl. That was wide-ranging. Yes, it had great depth as well as breadth, and so that really gave us a good overview of the whole picture. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to the question answer period. Before I turn it over to Ed, whatever Daryl said that you have questions about, please do put those in the chat box, and choose me as the person to whom those are coming, because I'm going to be the one sorting things through, and you can do it now. Some people have already started to do it. And then the same thing with Ed. Ed will be willing to take questions as well if you have questions about what he's about to say. So let me just take a moment to introduce, as our respondent, Ed Aguilar, JD. He has been our Coalition for Peace Action Pennsylvania director for over 10 years, and done an outstanding job in that role. And he also was president of the Lawyers Alliance for World Security for a number of years, and also taught international law at St. Joseph's University. So Ed has had a very interesting career that has intersected with the issues that we work on in many different ways. And so it's my honor to turn over the mic to Ed Aguilar for a response.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So yes, that was an excellent presentation by Daryl. He kind of covered the waterfront on nuclear arms history, and hopefully, we really hope, resuming negotiations. My immediate response to your remarks, Daryl, are to say that you've shown clearly that in the end, nuclear weapons do not actually create a real strategic advantage. Witness today, as you mentioned, instead they may actually create much more isolation, as in the case of of Putin and his war and attacks on Ukraine. So they are really not that useful as a military or geopolitical instrument. So I'm glad you kind of pointed that out. And in the end, what we have to do is to go back not only to enforce the bilateral agreement, but the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which of course imposes the obligation to all its signers, including all of the nuclear weapons states who have signed, to begin in good faith to disarm those weapons. So it goes beyond our bilateral relations, but it certainly is not a great strategic advantage. And of course, in the end, the only way we will actually overcome the threats is to actually disarm them. And I am so glad that we now have over 100 countries who have subscribed to the tenets of the Nuclear Ban Treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the formal title. So that has to be our ultimate objective for the world. But having said that, let me go back to my remarks. And they will center on the whole question of a Christmas armistice or truce, which was initially proposed by the International Peace Bureau, which is based in Switzerland and has members from all over the place, all over Europe and much of the world. And we will actually put up on the chat, and I'll do this as soon as I'm concluded my remarks, the link to the International Peace Bureau and the page that will give you the original resolution that they have proposed on a Christmas to Christmas ceasefire, let's call it. The reason I say that is the Western Christmas, so to speak, in the Protestant and Catholic churches is, of course, December 25th. But the Eastern Orthodox churches use January, I believe it was the Gregorian calendar way back, and they still use that that as the date for, let's call it, the Eastern Orthodox Christmas. So the idea of the Christmas truce or the holiday truce, it happens that we're now celebrating Hanukkah as well, so a little bit ahead of that. But in any case, this truce, the whole idea goes back to the notion of the Christmas truce that was actually agreed upon, more than agreed, during World War I. The troops on the front line, that is British troops, that is German troops, French troops, and Belgian troops, agreed on a truce during Christmas. And that truce was informal, was not actually organized by the governments, but by the actual fighters, the actual troops themselves. And it didn't last very long, but it was an inspiration and should be an inspiration to us today. So, as I mentioned, the International Peace Bureau initiated this. Right now, it would be a great time to step back, which is what a truce will do, to step back from this war and reanalyze, give both the Ukrainians and the Russians a pause to be able to say, what are we really doing here? What are our objectives? how do we bring this to an end? Now, President Biden met recently with President Macron of France, who came to Washington for the first state visit as our oldest ally, which France is. And in that dialogue, in that time together, they spoke, of course, quite a bit, both privately and publicly, about Ukraine and what we can do to resolve that situation. And what Presidents Biden and Macron said was that they cannot force Ukraine to negotiate, and they will not. It's Ukraine's sovereign territory. It's Ukraine who are the defenders, and they will not force them to be the initiators. But when it is ready, President Biden added that, quote, if Russia is ready to talk, the USA is willing. This was December 1st. It was the first time that President Biden has said that. But he added that is now the ball is in Russia's court. It is up to Mr. Putin. And Putin has not given a clear response. In fact, he repeated recently that nuclear arms are still, on the table for use. So Russia and the US must realize that the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons can lead to expanding the war from the territory of Ukraine to Russia itself and to neighboring NATO countries. As a matter of fact, there's already been kind of a spillover into Moldova, which is a narrow country, an independent country, which aligns itself with the West on the western side of Ukraine, but which Russia has had historic ties with as well. And it's very much exposed to Russian attack. So I'm concerned for not only Ukraine, but Moldova. And there have also been apparently accidental strikes into Polish territory. So this war could be expanding already. It's the last thing we need. We need it not to expand, but to end. And we support the proposal of the International Peace Bureau. I'm going to put that on the chat for you, and you can, link to it and follow up later. And so finally, I would add that on our CFPA website, you can find out what you can do in terms of Congress. Go to the Senate, go to the Congress, tell our senators that the time for a ceasefire is sooner rather than later. So thanks very much, and I'd be happy to share in the question and answers at the conclusion.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ed. We really appreciate that addition. And wouldn't it be great if, what a great Christmas present for the whole world, if we could get a ceasefire and take those 2 weeks between the Western Christmas and the Eastern Orthodox Christmas, take those 2 weeks to really give a pause to all this violence and explore really in a significant way a pathway toward peace and toward ending this war. So I do have a few questions in the chat box, and we have time for more, so please submit more if you have one. I want to start with a question about, well, let me just read it. I have heard that the USA provided a guarantee to Ukraine as an inducement for their surrender of nuclear weapons. the guarantee, of course, was to not expand NATO eastward toward Russia. Have we reneged on that promise is the question. So Daryl, why don't you share on that first, and Ed, you can chime in if you'd like to as well.
Well, if I understand the question, I mean, when Ukraine became independent in 1991, it agreed to relinquish to Russia the strategic nuclear weapons it inherited when the Soviet Union fell apart. This was, and to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. This was known as the Budapest Memorandum, and it also obliged the United States to assist, and I got to get the right words, in supporting Ukraine's independence, as did Russia and the UK. There's been talk for some time of the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. The Bush administration indicated in 2008 that Ukraine might be considered for membership in NATO. Nothing has happened since then, yet Russia has used this possibility as a concern Ukraine as a threat to Russia. I would say the more immediate proximal cause for Putin's invasion of Ukraine in Crimea in 2013 and this more expansive invasion in 2022 is, Putin's own internal need for building up nationalist support for his regime. It is his concern about a EU and European leaning government in Kiev, and the Russians, if you listen to their version of history, keep talking about the coup in 2014, the Maidan Revolution that overthrew the corrupt Russian-supported president. So, I mean, there are a lot of arguments that the Russians have leveled about the role of NATO expansion in justifying their, I would say, imperialist aggression in Ukraine. My organization, before I arrived here and since, been critical of the decision by NATO to expand eastward without a more, accommodation with Russia over its security. But we are where we are, and I don't think personally there's anything that NATO has done or Ukraine has done or has been said that justifies what Russia has done. We have to, but history is history, and there are different interpretations. And the challenge now is how to get out of this quagmire, and not just how to, in my view, end the hot conflict, but how to keep the peace for years beyond. So we got to think about what the long-term solution is, and I think it will require some combination of assurances to Ukraine about respecting its territorial integrity, hopefully according to its original borders, but also assuring Russia that threat that and has been talking about. But that's going to take a lot of talk. That's going to take a lot of getting over mistrust and getting beyond the propaganda, especially on the Russian side, that is just, it's beyond reason and fact. If you listen to the Russian cable news, it's worse than Fox News here in the United States by far. So that's that's a long answer to a short question, but
that's all right. It's all right. Ed, do you want to add anything? I know I have some things to add.
I would
myself.
only, Yeah, I would only add one quick thing, which is the history of this is very interesting. There are two agreements called Minsk I and Minsk II, which are worth looking up. And what they showed was that, you know, back in 91 and 92, Ukraine gave up a lot, you know. They gave up, I believe, 3,000 nuclear weapons that were left on their soil when they became independent from Russia. George Bunn, who was, you mentioned, the Lawyers Alliance for World Security. By the way, I was not the national president. I was only the Pennsylvania president. I want to make that clear, of the Lawyers Alliance for World Security. Thomas Graham Jr., Ambassador Tom Graham, was, for much of the time I was there, was our chairman and CEO at the Lawyers Alliance. But yeah, I was chair of the Pennsylvania chapter. And in any case, George Bunn, who was also on our board, was very active in that agreement with the Ukrainians and both Minsk I and Minsk II. And I believe that going back to those agreements, you know, there's a lot of good language there that should be restored. And you know, the negotiation should not really be all that complicated. Ukraine is a sovereign state, has been since the Soviet Union dissolved, and all of its rights and responsibilities as a sovereign state, you know, should be enforced.
Thank you. Let me just add a few things myself. The person who asked the question actually clarified once I asked it that a part of it was about what are the defensive obligations to Ukraine. And I think those are in writing, and Daryl already alluded to those. And so, but you know, both the US and Russia were supposed to support any self-defense for Ukraine if anybody attacked it. But what's not in writing, and this goes to what Daryl was said, that sometimes history is in the eye of the beholder, and it can make things squishy, is as I've researched this, it seems pretty clear to me that there were multiple verbal assurances that were given to Russia and its predecessor, the Soviet Union, including Gorbachev. And actually, one of those was witnessed by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who did a webinar for us early this spring. And he said he was in the room. And of course, the Secretary of State, James Baker, at the time said, we're not going to go 1 inch closer to Russia. NATO is not going to expand eastward. So there were these and other assurances were given, including to Yeltsin, but they were only verbal. Now, one of the people who instigated the formation of the Coalition for Peace Action was a longtime member of Trinity Church here in Princeton, was the late George Kennan, former US ambassador to Russia. And he had a very deep insight into Russian mentality, and especially how paranoid they can be about anybody doing anything that might seem to endanger their territorial integrity. And he said one of the worst mistakes we could make would be to expand NATO eastward after the end of the Cold War. And of course, we expanded in a very big way. Many more countries joined NATO. And so there is, you know, some ambiguity there. I think definitely a big mistake was made to basically just ignore Russia's concerns. At the same time, I agree totally with what Daryl said. Nothing justifies the brutal invasion that they have undertaken against Ukraine. So very messy situation. There is another question here, actually from Sally Jones, a leader of New York State Peace Action. Are you in touch with any civil society groups that work on arms control in Russia?
Yes. Hi, Sally. How are you? Glad you're with us tonight. We are, although it's a lot more difficult to do so in these difficult times. You know, the Arms Control Association and other, you know, U.S.-based nuclear weapons, arms control disarmament groups have maintained contacts with non-governmental Russian experts for years. I mean, some of these personal relationships go back, my goodness, to, the 80s with the organization. But it has become much more difficult to maintain the dialogue because we can't travel and meet in common places as easily. It's hard to have some conversations via Zoom because if you're doing a Zoom meeting with Russians, the FSB is listening, and who else knows who's listening? And the Russian colleagues have to be extremely careful about what they say. And even if we do have opportunities to meet, and there are a couple of projects we're involved in that have brought Russian and European and US experts together to talk about some of the problems I was just discussing on arms control. We've met in Istanbul, Turkey, for instance, for a 3-day meeting in September. Even if we can do that, it's very hard to organize joint efforts to try to push our respective governments in the right direction, mainly because the Russian experts and NGOs are dealing with a system that is trying to punish anybody who criticizes the official government line. So they have to be extremely careful. Yet there's some things we can do. For instance, just last week, our tripartite U.S., German, Russian Deep Cuts Commission, we call it, we issued a joint statement calling on the U.S. and Russia to resume the dialogue on the implementation of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. We called on the immediate start of talks on a new nuclear arms control framework. And we issued that, and so far as we know, our Russian colleagues have not been slapped on the wrist or more. So it's difficult, but it's important that we maintain that contact. I will also say that some of us have tried to maintain a line of communication with official government, Russian government officials. The embassy here in Washington is led by the ambassador who co-negotiated the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, Anatoly Antonov. So, I have reached out to him once. He has reached out here once to have a dialogue on strategic stability. I don't think that the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is particularly influential right now. I think the major decisions that are being made by the Russian government are being made by Putin and his immediate advisors in the Kremlin, and the MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is really trying to explain away sometimes unexplainable actions. But nevertheless, it's a communications channel that's important to keep open, and we will use it when and if necessary. And we have been encouraging the U.S. government to do the same. But the communication channels, the official channels, are limited and they're sporadic. That's the reality at the moment, and that's one of the big problems we have.
Ed, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right with everything Daryl has just said. I would only wanted to say we'd be remiss not to mention that 3 peace groups shared the Nobel Peace Prize this year, just last week in Oslo. As you know, the Norwegian Parliament has a committee that awards the Nobel Peace Prize, and they were peace groups and human rights groups, really, in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. And I think the Nobel Committee was sending a message, that human rights are threatened in all 3 of those countries. So I applaud their choice of those 3 winners of the Nobel Peace Prize.
Thank you, Ed. So one more question, and then I'll offer a few comments to wrap up. And this is from Larry Holman, a Navy veteran who unfortunately had to leave just a few minutes ago, but I still think his question is a good one. Why does Putin feel threatened by NATO and its neighbors? Are his fears irrational? And if so, why can't the world isolate him so that he is removed from a position of control over the use of nuclear weapons?
Well, that's a big question.
Sure is, isn't it?
I wish I had the answer. Well, I think, you know, Putin, you know, he's rational in that he is basing his decisions and judgments upon experience and facts. I think he's coming to the wrong conclusions. He's very willing to take risk and to violate the rules. He's operating now in a system that, in which he has no checks and balances. So, I mean, as a result of these things, his concerns about NATO, I think, have become highly exaggerated, in part because he's hearing from people who are trying to feed his, he's like Trump, he's narcissistic in some ways. He doesn't want to hear advice that's contrary to his existing opinion or conclusions. So, all of this is kind of feeding his frustrations and grievances about how Russia has been treated in the post-Cold War period. He wants to make Russia great again, to borrow a phrase. And so, he's trying to build up nationalism and the legitimacy of what he's doing in Ukraine by creating an enemy. And not creating, but accentuating a known enemy and making it larger. So that's my off the cuff kind of explanation of why he's concerned about NATO. I mean, I think the other reason why he's concerned about NATO is that NATO, by definition, is designed to protect NATO countries from Russia. Okay, therefore, Russia sees NATO as an enemy. I mean, so this is the missed opportunity of the 90s, okay, to transform the old, Western and Soviet East Bloc relationship into something different. And it has gradually, over the last 20 years, been going off in the wrong direction. Why can't we isolate Putin? And I mean, I think, Putin is being isolated internationally. The Russian economy is extremely sanctioned, economic, financial sanctions. Putin has very few friends. The support for the war inside Russia is decreasing. It's hard to measure. He doesn't have an easy exit strategy here. They're losing on the conventional battlefield. Nuclear threats have not worked, and he's backed down from these nuclear threats. So, where all this heads, I cannot say. What I'm concerned about is a desperate Putin at a point where his war objectives are clearly not being met. And what does he do in that situation? So that's one reason why we need to have a diplomatic strategy in place and channels to negotiate a more peaceful end to this conflict than it might otherwise be. But it's a situation that none of us have seen ever, and we're in a completely uncharted territory. So I think that I would just end by reminding us that there are some things that we can influence and control. And I think one of them is making sure that this conflict does not escalate beyond the borders of Ukraine and lead to nuclear weapons use, and that the United States and Russia, despite all of these deep differences relating to the war and other issues, the mistrust, continue to perform their most basic responsibility, which is to make sure that we manage these deadly nuclear arsenals more responsibly than less responsibly. And that means getting back to the negotiating table. And that's something that our U.S. peace and arms control and disarmament community knows how to do. I think we need to, roll up our sleeves and get back to work again in the coming year.
Well, thank you very much, Daryl, and also Ed. I thought this was a very enlightening evening, and I know it expanded my horizons and gave me a deeper understanding of what's happening and what some of the possibilities might be to move forward. We did say we would try to end by 8:15, and so let me just make a few closing announcements before that time arrives. And thank you all for joining the webinar this evening. It is being recorded. That question was asked, and we'll get that up on our website under recent events fairly soon. And also, Daryl, the request was made for the many good links that you posted in the chat box. Somebody was saying it was too hard to pull them out of that. If you could send those to me by email, we would love to post those as well, along with this talk that you gave. Again, these are the resources that the Arms Control Association provides, and that Daryl is a leader on, are really spectacular and highly regarded by all knowledgeable parties in this realm. Coming up, it is December, so it's the holiday season, but we still have a few more things that are happening, and one of those is for those of you that are within a driving distance of Princeton, we would love for you to come to Princeton this Saturday. We are spearheading a solidarity vigil against hate and bigotry. And that is going to be in Palmer Square in Princeton from 3 to 4 o'clock this Saturday. It's being co-sponsored by Not in Our Town, Princeton, as well as the Bayard Rustin Center for Social Justice and the Princeton Democratic Organization, Community Democratic Organization. And it's an opportunity for us to respond to this horrible crisis of internal violence that has emerged within our own nation of hate crimes. It's really been a very troubling surge of that, and especially since 2016, when Donald Trump first ran for president. This has become more and more overt violence is being practiced, and the hatred that is so insidious in social media and on the internet. It's more than just words. Too often these are being turned into violence, and even mass violence, as we've seen a number of times this year, way too many times. So please join us this Saturday if you can. And also we are co-sponsoring again a New Year's Eve Peace Vigil with the Trenton Friends meeting. That'll be at 5 o'clock on New Year's Eve. And so again, information on both those events is at our website, peacecoalition.org. In the near future, we will also get the recording of tonight's webinar on our website, along with the links that Daryl is going to be sending me, so that you can share this great information that's been covered tonight with your contacts and revisit it yourself. So again, thanks to all of you for joining us. Special thanks to Daryl and to Ed for being our presenters tonight. Have a great evening. Happy holiday to everybody.